and I'm the executive director of the Berkeley Institute, and I'm the co-PI of the African American Intellectual Traditions Initiative. I have no big role in this podcast that was referenced, other than that I direct the Berkeley Institute, and I support that we are co-sponsoring the podcast. But the podcast is the brilliant brainchild of my dear friends and colleagues, Professor Chayuma Elliott and Dr. Chad Hagelmeyer. Professor Chayuma Elliott is a senior fellow at the Berkeley Institute. Dr. Chad Hagelmeyer is a remote staff of the Berkeley Institute, and basically the best people ever. So I'm going to play a few clips to start off, some little teaser trailers, so you have a little bit of a taste of what this podcast is about. These are these are Instagram reels. So if their context seems strange, just, bear in mind that these are made for social media. So.
If Phyllis Wheatley writes a transcendentally good poem and no one reads it, does it matter?
It obviously does, right?
Yeah, in To My Cenas Land, Private Triumph is totally not good enough. And the reason is that Wheatley is trying to establish the legitimacy of an African poet in this Western tradition of poetry that she has inherited.
Okay, so that's teasing the episode about Phyllis Wheatley. I'm going to play a few more just to give you more of a taste of the range of conversation topics that are on this podcast. This podcast is called Old School.
In his passage, the classics are what help you visualize a free and beautiful future. They're what get you to the top of Mount Pisgah. And he accuses racist white people of keeping the classics away from African Americans as a way to try to keep black people oppressed.
So the people withholding Aristotle and Aurelius, and also Balzac and Dumas, are like Pharaoh.
Exactly. They're the man. And according to Du Bois' analogy, God is not on their side.
Okay, one more.
Chad, let's jump back to the beginning of the poem for a minute. What do you make of the fact that the siren song at the beginning of the poem is a metaphor for childbirth, its sound and its broken waters? When water broke into 1,000 blossoms in a landlocked town of the south, before my name was heard in the womb-shaped world of deep sonorous waters, coming out for rights.
Yeah, that's a lot of womb imagery.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all I'm going to play. I wanted to give all three of those because I wanted to give a kind of a taste and range and flavor of the tone and the serious engagement with the classics, but also the removal of the kind of self-serious posture that can often accompany that kind of engagement. You all should check out this podcast. It's called Old School. You can find it linked to the Berkeley Institute website, has a link that for the African American Intellectual Traditions Initiative, or 80, rhymes with Haiti, that's how we refer to it. And it links the podcast, and you can also email me. You can find it on all podcast platforms. Like I said, it's one of these creative efforts that we're trying to sponsor as the Berkeley Institute with this kind of creative engagement with the classics and the classical tradition, classics or broadly English classics, humane tradition generally, that provides a different means for students to encounter what otherwise is often seen as intention, right? So the slogan is Black plus Classics. These things are Black studies and the classics are often not studied together, and that's what this endeavor does. So part of the African American Intellectual Traditions Initiative, 80, is also sponsor some courses on campus, one of which I'm teaching this summer. And so if you permit me, I will kind of give you a little side story about the course I'm teaching and some of the texts we're engaging as a means to approach the questions of this panel. How do we creatively engage the classics in ways that aren't exclusive, et cetera? So when we think of African American novelists who demonstrate an engagement with the classical past and the whole tradition of humanistic learning in the West, the first novelist we go to is Ralph Ellison. Ralph Ellison's only completed novel, Invisible Man, the first novel by an African-American writer to win the National Book Award, is rife with nods and send-ups to Homer and Dante, as well as to American figureheads like Emerson and Melville. The novel very explicitly positions itself as heir to a classical as well as American literary past, as the protagonist becomes aware of his experience as invisible as a Black man in pre-civil rights era America. But in a course I will teach under the 80 Initiative, I will make the argument to my students that it is just as valuable and important to read Richard Wright as an example of productive engagement with the classical and humane traditions. For while Wright does not name drop Dante, he tests very seriously the Western intellectual tradition's ideas about what it means to be human. In making this point to my students, I'll first have them read Richard Wright's novel, The Man Who Lived Underground, which is almost certainly an uncredited inspiration for Ellison's Invisible Man. Wright said that this novel is his most inspired work, closest to his heart. A play on the allegory of Plato's cave, it is a surrealist psychological novel exploring what happens when man attempts to look at human society from outside it. Then I'll have my students read selections from Wright's autobiography, originally titled Black Confession. I'm sure that you guys can all pick up on the inheritance there. And it was later changed to the title of American Hunger, which was later changed by publishers to the slightly more pejorative title, Black Boy, which picks up on classical ideas that deep hunger for truth is at the heart of human experience. I'll then read with my students Wright's novel, The Outsider, which extends themes from The Man Who Lived Underground. This is a crazy novel. Wright told Ellison that The Outsider was above all about Black Americans' relationship to the West, and uses the position of an African-American man living outside of the social margins in pre-civil rights era America to assess the philosophical grounding of Western culture in post-war America and Europe. In contrast to the uneducated protagonist of his earlier novel, Native Son, the protagonist and anti-hero, Cross Damon, is a former University of Chicago philosophy student, smitten with nihilistic critiques of Western ideas of the human. In an effort to live apart from human society and sunk by his own ego, he commits a string of murders that lead to his own demise. As Wright's biographer puts it, The Outsider is an attempt to depict the explosion of the social unit, the civil anarchy that results from the growing concentration of power, the weakening of faith, the secularization of man, the advent of the Nietzschean man who has become his own little god, all characteristics of the crisis in our civilization. This novel is specifically indebted to Heidegger, Dostoevsky, and Kierkegaard, and specifically Kierkegaard's book, The Concept of Dread, which Wright, quote, carried around with him everywhere, and interestingly enough, read and discussed with Hannah Arendt and Paul Tillich. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, why don't I know this Richard Wright? The first reason is that most of Richard Wright's more philosophical texts were not published in their full version until after his death, including those I just mentioned, and some of which have only been published in the last few years. And this is because Wright's publishers rejected or radically cut the more philosophical dimensions of his project that did not match with readers' appetite for the more social realist politics of Native Son. They basically cut what they thought wouldn't sell. And then here's the second reason. Richard Wright's early novel, Native Son, was the first novel by an African-American writer to be read widely by white American audiences. And so subsequent novelists like Ralph Ellison and James Baldwin were defined against it, against its seemingly clear politics, and against the protest it was seen as enacting. Both James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison shored up the credentials of their own careers by criticizing Wright's writing as protest fiction. Distinguishing himself from Wright, Ellison said that Wright was a relative, but writers like T.S. Eliot, Melville, Faulkner were Ellison's chosen ancestors. But I have a third reason why I think we don't know this philosophical version of Richard Wright. It is hard to narrate an engagement with the humane tradition that doesn't match the idea we have in our heads. More often than not, we think of engagement as affirming the best parts of these intellectual traditions, as Ellison quite literally does in the conclusion of his novel. His narrator says he is affirming the principle that underwrites the American democratic project, even as he hates the racial injustice across its history. But engagement can also be critique. Engagement can also be straining the tradition in a way that expands it. Engagement can be magnifying the tradition's weaknesses and thinking through the consequences of its assumptions. And, in fact, it can promise to be a deeper way of engaging the humane tradition, deeper than genuflecting or paying homage or name-dropping. So what does all this story with Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison have to do with approaching the classics in creative and productive ways? I have two big suggestions. First, we can share the value of the humane tradition by enacting and teaching the intellectual virtues that promote slow, patient, generous work. This is something that's come up already throughout the day. The example of Richard Wright is helpful for me because it reminds me that it is slow, patient, generous reading that is willing to be surprised, that is richly rewarded. I don't want to teach my students to pass judgment on Wright's publishers, who cut out the engagements with the humane tradition that were closest to the heart of Wright's project. Rather, I want my students to take these publishers as an admonition. It is all too easy to passively accept the categories of protest fiction versus literary fiction, especially when professional advancement is at stake. And yet, to read Wright slowly, to catch the subtle engagement of perennial questions like, what is man, is to do the kind of thinking that makes the humane tradition so valuable in the first place. Faculty and students alike face unprecedented pressures of professionalization and credentialing. This is, again, something we've been talking about constantly. Grades, fellowships, jobs, the tenure ladder can never wholly accommodate the slow, patient work that leaves ample room for nuance, personal reflection, and untidy categories. Scalable consumer models of education, especially at a huge public university like my own, on one hand make education more accessible for a larger group of people, but they also risk making intellectual content condensable, quickly consumable, and uprooted from the complicated traditions that inform ideas. Institutes like the Berkeley Institute, Collegium, and others can create off-campus environments that support such exploration without the pressures of credentialing and professionalization. We've talked about this already too. Environments that let students try on ideas beyond their majors or subfields, that make more accessible those complicated humanist traditions, can help students read for those questions, what does it mean to be human? But my second and perhaps even more important point, I want to teach my students to recognize and value the difference between claiming the tradition and taking its claims seriously. I want to teach my students not to be pious acolytes, but rather to be able to think through the consequences of the ideas that the humane tradition preserves. I want students to understand real learning as not being able to catch a Homeric reference, but being able to think seriously about what it means to be human, who man is in relation to God, and what it means to live in the world with others. The example of Richard Wright is helpful to me because it demonstrates a writer who is participating in the humane tradition by straining it. And of course, Richard Wright's two huge influences, Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard, are also examples of minds straining against the tradition and thereby expanding it. These writers engage the classical and humane traditions, but do so in a way that maintain an important ambivalent relationship to it. And in doing so, might help us undo the idolatrous orientations that we have towards it. Someone once told me that your best student isn't your disciple, it's your heretic, because the latter keeps you in conversation. I want to teach my students to value the parts of the humane tradition that keep it all in check. And in this instance with the Outsider by Richard Wright, having my students read a novel in which somebody reads Nietzsche and then starts killing people is a nice way to kind of interrogate the consequences of a certain thought, and maybe keeping it all in check. For the humane tradition is not a monolithic thing of uniform ideas, but conversations, debates, and critique that assess the possibilities and limits of ideas that have been thought before. Institutes like the Berkeley Institute and Collegium and others can help create spaces where students are not fashioned to perform the pieties of the contemporary university, nor are they trained to perform the pieties of a classical chauvinism. Rather, they can be places where, to quote W.E.B. Du Bois, and I do this to reference the clip from earlier, students can sit with Shakespeare and move arm in arm with Balzac. And Dumas, the complete quote. There you go. Thank you.
I am just going to set a timer for myself to make sure I don't go on too long. Okay. Can you all hear me? Yep. Yes, terrific. Okay. First, I'd like to thank Dhananjay for inviting me to join this rich conversation. I also want to thank Dan and his wife, Kaysen, who's not here, because I admire many things about them, but the one I'd like to highlight is their courage. I've never started a nonprofit, but I hear it's a lot of work. And one never knows if these things will work out. And particularly when you have a lot of mouths to feed, as Dan and Kaysen do, I think it takes a great deal of courage to build an organization, especially one that's been as successful as this one. I also like to thank the Collegium Institute staff for putting together this extraordinary event. And finally, I'd like to thank Molly and Jim Perry for seeing the need for an organization like Collegium and for their generous support of it. Okay, I loved the questions that animate today's conversation. And in this talk, I'd like to focus on the following. Is it possible to cultivate, a posture of respect or even reverence toward the tradition of humane studies without leading to dominance or exclusivism? Not my question, but in the program, as you know. This question makes me think of a fundamental topic on campuses today, that is diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. I'll start there, and then I'd like to consider how engaging in the tradition of humane studies can, I think, enrich our conversations around DEI. Finally, I also hope to say something about the role of new centers in doing this kind of work. 2 years ago, I heard a talk in Chicago by Eboo Patel, president of Interfaith America. It was a wonderful talk. If you haven't heard him speak before, I suggest looking him up on YouTube. Eboo Patel is a Rhodes Scholar, a prolific author, and a Muslim who dedicates himself to interfaith initiatives. The gist of his talk was something like the following. Diversity, equity, and inclusion programs accomplish good work. They challenge us to address the real problems that our country faces, especially with regard to race, ethnicity, class, and other categories. DEI programs do good work, but, and this is key for Patel, they have a religion problem. And I'll repeat that because it's also the central problem I'd like to discuss today. DEI has a religion problem. I'd like to address the elephant in the room. You might be asking yourself, why is this white guy talking about diversity? And so diversity is something that I think about in my own way every day. I'm a native Spanish speaker, son of immigrants from Latin America. My dad is a Jew from Costa Rica. My mom and her family left Cuba when Castro came to power. And now, as a father, I speak to my kids almost exclusively in Spanish, which weirds people out. So a common exchange that I have is something like this. What language are you speaking? Spanish. Oh, wow, it didn't sound like Spanish. I thought maybe it was Italian. In other words, I'm guessing people didn't expect, the white guy to be speaking Spanish. In any case, I enjoy these interactions. They almost always lead to friendly conversations. And I'm telling you this just to make the point that diversity is something that's often on my mind. Now, besides being a white Latino and a Spanish speaker, I'm also a Catholic. I work at the Lumen Christi Institute for Catholic Thought, based at the University of Chicago. We think of ourselves as a sister institute to Collegium. When I think about diversity, I think about race and ethnicity, but also about religion. Earlier this year, one professor at U Chicago said that Lumen Christi contributes intellectual diversity to campus, which I was delighted to hear. And that comment made me think about how our mission at Lumen Christi is fundamentally a mission that relates to diversity. We're not interested in being preachy. We want to engage in dialogue on campus. We think that Catholics have something to learn from the secular university, and at the same time, the secular university can learn something from the Catholic intellectual tradition. I noted already that Eboo Patel thinks that diversity, equity, and inclusion programs have a religion problem. I'm kind of loud, maybe I'll step aside. Patel argues that by talking about religion, we can enhance DEI programs. I'd like to make an argument that's similar to that, not exactly the same. I'd like to think with you today about how the Catholic tradition can enrich discussions related to diversity and inclusion. And to do that, I'd like to tell you a story about one of my favorite Catholics, who is a medieval polymath named Ramon Lull. And I should have done a PowerPoint, I'm just realizing, but his last name is spelled L-L-U-L-L, if you want to look him up, Ramon Lull. So why Ramon Lull? Many medieval Christian scholars came from the Catholic priesthood, but Lull was a layman. He was inspired by St. Francis of Assisi, but he wasn't a priest or a friar. You might describe him as a scholar and a missionary. He had no formal education, but he managed to write 250 works in the field of philosophy, especially logic, and scholars describe his Ars Magna, the great art in Latin, as his most important work. he designed it as a method to pursue the truth through dialogue between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. A little about Lowell. I'm a historian, so I have to give you dates. He was born around 1232 on the island of Majorca, which is one of the islands off the coast of eastern Spain. King James I had captured Majorca from the Muslim king Abu Yahya in 1229, not long before Lowell was born. Now, during Lowell's lifetime, the Spanish kingdoms were a land of multiple languages, cultures, and faiths. Muslims had lived on the Iberian Peninsula since the year 711. They'd lost much of their land in Spain by Lowell's lifetime, but they continued to hold the kingdom of Granada, Al-Andalus, in the south. Many Muslims and Jews lived in Christian Spain, and with good reason, the medieval Spanish kingdoms often are described as the geographical and spiritual frontier between the Abrahamic faiths. This is all to say that the encounter between Christians, Jews, and Muslims was the context for the life and work of Ramon Lowell. Now, Lowell advocated something like what we might call interfaith dialogue today, but that term is only accurate in the simple sense of respectful conversation between people of different faiths. When you study medieval Europe and the pre-modern world, interfaith dialogue can be a misleading concept because it's associated with the idea that all religions represent equally valid truth claims. And this is not Lowell's point of view. He didn't think that Christianity, Islam, and Judaism were all basically the same. He argued in favor of peaceful discussions between Christians, Jews, and Muslims, and he clearly considered Christianity the true religion. Throughout his life, he advocated different methods of evangelization to foster conversion to Christianity. Lowell wrote many books in Latin, but he also wrote in Catalan, which was his native language, and he wanted to do so to make his work accessible to a broader group of people. Today, I'd like to tell you about one of his stories, which is called The Book of the Gentile and the Three Wise Men. It's a fictional conversation, and Lowell explores how interreligious dialogue can serve as a way to pursue truth. It also can be described as a story about friendship, in which several laymen take the time to listen carefully and learn from one another. Their conversations are always civil, even friendly, and this is especially notable because Lowell is writing during the Crusades. So there's all this violence in the background, and he's saying, we should have peaceful conversations. He also, at various points in his life, was in favor of violence. So he's a really kind of tricky figure to wrap your mind around. Anyway, I'll tell you about this story, but it's just one side of his views. So Lowell offers these three wise men as models for how to engage in fruitful conversation about religion with people of different backgrounds. It sounds a little bit like a joke at the beginning. So it's like, a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim walk into a bar. Anyway, so Lowell describes the scene as follows. Three wise men met upon leaving a city. One was a Jew, the other a Christian, the third a Muslim. When they were outside the city and saw each other, they approached and greeted each other in friendly fashion. And they accompanied one another, each inquiring about the other's health and what he intended to do. And all three decided to enjoy themselves together so as to gladden their spirits, overtaxed by study. So here at the start of the book, Lowell makes it clear to his reader that discussions about faith are especially fruitful in the context of friendship. Lowell saw these friendships as the basis for exploring truth together. He did not see divisions between faith as good in themselves, but those divisions could inspire a fruitful intellectual journey. In the prologue, Lowell invites his readers to take the time to know the deepest feelings and needs of their fellow travelers. He gives a detailed account of the Gentile, who is the protagonist, who's a guy going through some pretty serious emotional struggles. Lowell says the following: "By divine dispensation, it came to pass that in a certain land there lived a Gentile, very learned in philosophy, who began to worry about old age, death, and the joys of this world." It should be said that the Gentile here is not a Gentile in the scriptural sense. It's a Gentile in the sense of someone who doesn't know God. Lowell says, "This Gentile had no knowledge of God, nor did he believe in the resurrection, nor did he think anything existed after death. Whenever the Gentile thought about these things, his eyes filled with tears and weeping, and his heart with sighs and sadness and pain, for he was so fond of this worldly life, and he found so horrible the thought of death and the notion that after death he would be nothing, that he was unable to console himself or stop crying, nor could he drive the sadness from his heart." In this passage, we learn that Lowell's Gentile is a person with concerns and with fears. Lowell offers his readers a sympathetic portrait to suggest, I think, that the audience should approach their peers with a similar sensitivity. Now, most of this book is about each of the three wise men making an argument about his faith to the Gentile. You should be a Jew for this reason. You should be a Christian for this reason. You should be a Muslim, so on. You might wonder if Lowell wrote this story as a straightforward argument for conversion to Catholic Christianity. The Christian, the Jew, the Muslim meet the Gentile. They all make a pitch for their religion. The Christian wins. Yay, Christianity. But it doesn't go that way. The text repeatedly emphasizes friendship as a basis for conversation. So, for example, in the first chapter of the book, the three wise men actually work together to argue that God exists and that humans can hope for life after death. They identify the shared points of their traditions before they go into the differences. And throughout the text, Christianity is not the clear winner. It's not the winner at all, actually. Lowell's tone is far from combative. He also gives adequate accounts of other faith traditions. In fact, one eminent scholar describes Lowell as offering reasonably sound knowledge of Islam and Judaism. So we covered some basics of the story. I've got just a couple of minutes, so I'll offer some thoughts as to how this story relates to diversity and inclusion. So far, we've seen some basic concepts that Lowell values: friendship, being attentive to others' feelings, learning about their traditions. You might say that these things sound like insights you could glean from a diversity and inclusion program. But there's one clear thing that makes Lowell's story different. Though the Christian, the Jew, and the Muslim get along, the message is clear that there is one true religion. So Lowell says the following. One of the wise men says, "Think, gentlemen, of the harm that comes from men not belonging to a single sect, and of the good that would come from everyone being beneath one faith and one religion." And later on, another wise man says, what great fortune it would be if we could all, every man on earth, be under one religion and belief, so that there would be no more rancor or ill will among men who hate each other because of the diversity and contrariness of beliefs and sects. So the goal seems pretty clear: one God, one religion, one truth. Now there's more to Lowell. I'm going to spoil the ending for you. You can read this if you'd like. It's published by Princeton University Press. It's a wonderful story. Here's the end of the story. Lowell wanted to avoid a polemical argument that demonstrated the superiority of Christianity over Judaism and Islam. So at the end, the Gentile has heard all these different arguments for the different religions, and he says to the three wise men, I've made a decision. I'm going to tell you which one I've chosen. And then the three wise men answer saying, "That's great. Your decision. Don't tell us." And they say specifically, in order for each to be free to choose his own religion, they preferred not knowing which religion he would choose. All the more so, this is a question we could discuss among ourselves, to see by force of reason and by means of our intellects which religion it must be that you will choose. And, I love this line, if in front of us you state which religion it is that you prefer, then we would not have such a good subject of discussion, nor such satisfaction in discovering the truth. Okay, so instead of staying and listening to the Gentiles' conclusion, they leave and they say, have a nice life. Great to meet you. So last thoughts here. I find this ending fascinating, and I've wondered often, why did Ramon Lowell do this? He leaves you with a cliffhanger, And I thought initially that Lowell's story shares something with DEI in a very general sense. Different people come together, they listen and learn from each other. But I also thought that Lowell's story departs significantly from DEI because one of the wise men says, diversity leads to rancor and ill will. So that's kind of a big difference. Unity of belief would be better, they say. Now, the ending adds a significant nuance. The Christian, the Jew, and the Muslim don't want the Gentile to tell them the truth. If in front of us you state which religion it is that you prefer, then we would not have such a good subject of discussion. I want to leave you with this thought. It seems that the wise men delight in difference. Indifference, so not indifference, you know. they like difference. They definitely believe that there is one truth. That's very clear. And they want to get there. That's also very clear. But it also seems to me that they're saying, similar to Augustine in the Confessions, give me truth, but not yet. Thank you, folks.
I'm Dhananjay Jagannathan. I teach philosophy at Columbia University, and I also teach in our core curriculum in literature humanities, and I'm actually doing that this fall. And so I'd like to start by just talking a little bit about that experience. In order to get at the one remaining question, we didn't coordinate this, but we all chose different focal ones. To what extent can the tradition of humane studies, and the classical tradition in particular, become an aid to human flourishing, and to what extent can it become an idol? So I'll abbreviate that as, is the classical tradition an idol? Like a lot of students entering college, I didn't know what I didn't know. But I had a vague sense that it was rather a lot. And so I ended up in a great books-driven honors program at the University of Texas at Austin called Plan 2 Honors. And that meant that I was forced to take classes on subjects that I didn't have an antecedent interest in. And one of those was actually a small first-year seminar with 17 students and a faculty instructor, discussion-driven. And there were 10 or 11 of these that would run at a given year. And there was a ballot system for who got to sign up for which one. And I was the only member of my entire class who didn't get their first, second, or third choice, something we were told was virtually impossible. So I ended up in my fifth choice class, Introduction to Greek Political Thought, and I stand before you as a scholar of Greek political thought, not as a math and linguistics major, which is what I was at the time. So my encounter with this material, with Plato, with Thucydides, with Sophocles, was life-changing. And that was because I wanted the resources to think about issues like what is the best model for education and how should we organize a polity when people disagree. And those were questions that felt very pressing. I was going to college when the Iraq War was going very badly, and I'd grown up in a small conservative town in Texas where I was one of the only people who had been against it vocally and publicly. And because of my skin color and my ethnicity as an Indian American, that was maybe a bit of a foolish choice in some ways. Nothing really bad happened, but it was uncomfortable. And reading texts like Plato's Gorgias and the Republic helped me see better not what the answers to those questions ought to be, I'm still thinking about that, but what my questions should be. What are the sophisticated questions to ask in this area? And I took to that learning, that mode of learning, humanistic learning, where we are not after the final answer. Truth, but not yet. And I took to it well enough that I decided that I wanted to pursue further study of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy in particular. That came a little bit later. But I was called to mind recently by the death of my undergraduate mentor and advisor, that I had friends, I reached out to friends who had also studied with him, and many of them are doing quite different things. One of them works for a digital media company in Los Angeles, and did a degree in history, and then moved on, entered the workforce. And I think we had similarly transformative experiences. I have these memories with Benny of sitting up, in the hallway of our dormitory, where there were some places to study at midnight and 1 in the morning, talking about Plato. And if I can hold on to that sense as a scholar, I think I will be living a genuinely intellectual life. And when I went on to graduate school at the University of Chicago, where I encountered Lumen Christi, which had a further transformative effect on my interests, and even now as a faculty member at Columbia, I have tried to balance my scholarly work on ancient Greek and Roman philosophy with teaching in the liberal arts and teaching the classical tradition not as a specialist discipline, but as something that ought to concern everyone in some way. I feel very lucky to be able to teach in this way because it was so formative for me as a student, unencumbered by the burdens of disciplinary specialization. And because my students know that I'm a classicist and a philosopher, sometimes when we get to topics that they know are kind of within my academic remit, they'll ask me these sort of classicsy questions. And I always have to push back on them and tell them, no. Take a classics class if you want to talk about that, or take my History of Philosophy 1 class if you want to talk about that. We should keep the conversation at a level that concerns the most general and most humane questions, the ones that should matter to us all. So 2 days ago, I invited the students in my core class in Literature Humanities, where we endure a forced march from Homer to Toni Morrison traditionally at the end of the course, over the course of a year. I invited them to talk about what the core curriculum at Columbia does well and what it does badly. That's something I always do about a quarter of the way into the course, the midterm point in the fall. I find that that's more fruitful than giving them a midterm exam, actually. I tell them, this isn't a graded discussion, so please speak your mind. And on the side of the purely educational aims, I was very heartened to discover that 7 weeks into this 2-semester-long course, the students were almost uniformly positive about what they were getting from the course. They saw the benefits of reading text closely, more closely than they had done before, and of subjecting themselves to the rigors of argument and academic inquiry, and realizing that when it comes to these humanistic topics, we don't need to descend into debates that are about expressing taste, about preference, that there is a way of reasoning wisely about this material that depends on arguments, making arguments to one another, even as what each of us might get from a text remains quite distant, perhaps. And I want to return to that theme of a kind of unity and diversity shortly. They were also, I think, struck by the fact that we were encountering these grand themes of war and lineage and legacy in texts like the Iliad and the Odyssey, Genesis, Aeschylus's Oresteia, the things we've read so far. And yet, despite the grandeur of those themes, they were able to find ways of relating them to their own concerns. We had a particularly good conversation on Tuesday about the relationship between Genesis and the film Barbie, Greta Gerwig's film. Why might someone want to retell this ancient story, this 3,000-year-old story, here and now, especially if they don't themselves consider themselves religious, as Greta Gerwig does not? I think they also appreciate the environment of a small discussion-driven seminar, freedom from the demands of specialization, of learning one thing so they can go on and take another course where they learn another thing. And when you're at the beginning, and I remember this experience very distinctly when I started on the sequence of classes for the math major, the sense of this interminable mountain of things that I would have to master. And one of the things that humanistic education offers is the realization that thoughtful people are already well equipped from their reflection in their own lives to engage in these conversations. And I find that when I teach freshmen at Columbia University, and I've also found that when I've taught at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, where there were students in my class who didn't have a high school diploma and were perhaps not entirely literate in English. And yet they had things to say about the material we discussed. And there's also the importance of community in learning and inquiry. So these were all things that they found fruitful, and I want to lay that out because I also want to talk about what they found problematic about what we were doing. So here I turn to the question of idolatry, an underrated sin in our times, underestimated sin, anyway. The number one shortcoming of the endeavor of the core curriculum as a whole, and even our class, according to my students, the 22 that I asked on Thursday, and according to virtually every group of students I've ever asked this question, is that our curriculum is resolutely Eurocentric, with some exceptions at the very end, which invite the criticism of tokenism, and that this Eurocentric curriculum, the courses, I refer to the course by its second title, Literature Humanities. Courses at Columbia often have multiple titles. It's one of these funny things. We have very archaic IT systems, and so they will throw up the old title sometimes. The official title of the course in the books is Master Works of Western Civilization, or something like that, which, lays bare what the actual project is. And the students are alive to that. They know that there are intellectual and political projects that shape these curricula that they are probably at best suspicious of and more likely have some kind of active hostility toward. Now, I try to get them to talk about this without imposing my own views too much, but I also want them to make the best version of the argument, and so I try to push back on versions of the critique of this critique of Eurocentrism that they have often heard but not fully thought through or don't have the resources to really fully think through yet. And I try to steer them away from the weaker versions of this argument. So sometimes students will say, well, we're reading a bunch of dead white men. While Homer and Plato are certainly dead and certainly men, I think it's completely facile to talk about them as white. That's a racial categorization that was forged probably, let's say, I can't substantiate this claim, and I'm not a scholar in this area, but as far as I understand it, in the crucible of early modern European colonization, slavery, and empire, particularly in the New World. Right? The dominant categories that predate that, as we just heard, were Christian and pagan. And the difference between the indigenous peoples of the Americas who were to be converted to Christianity and Black Africans who were regarded as infidels and enemies defined the experience of colonization in the Americas over the next several hundred years. And a serious problem for the colonizers resulted when efforts were made to convert the descendants of Africans who were brought to the New World, because then you couldn't rely on the categories of pagan and Christian to justify slavery, and so you needed categories like black and white. And this is not, you can see the fascinating results of this in all over the Americas in places like Brazil and Mexico. Those are the places I'm most familiar with, but of course we are deeply familiar with this legacy in the United States. And so it is tempting to read everything before that point through that lens, and I want my students not to be quite so lazy when they talk about this topic. But of course, what they're pointing to is something a little bit more interesting, which is that the recruitment of the classical tradition, especially Greek literature and philosophy, for projects of European or so-called Western or white or whatever supremacy, that is certainly something that happens. It happens even now. You can go to any far-right website and see people, with little Spartan, their little logos on their anonymous accounts all have some reference to Sparta in them. The Third Reich famously was very into Sparta. They set up these academies on the model of Spartan education. But the history of German Philhellenism, I think, is probably, at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, is really the beginning of a robust version of this. It just, they wanted it to be obvious that the Germans were the obvious inheritors of the Greeks, and that the Greeks were the best. And this has informed a lot of classical scholarship. So I also teach our course in the history of philosophy, which is an introduction to philosophy that is very popular both with students who are doing this for general education, and it's also a required course for the philosophy major, and we have a robust philosophy major at Columbia. It's a very large course, and the traditional way, the course is called, again, History of Philosophy 1, but it's also got this other name, Pre-Socratics to Augustine. And the term pre-Socratics is it's an invention of a single scholar, Hermann Diels, in 1903 when he published an edition of the fragments of early Greek philosophers. And there had already been this tradition of locating the beginning of philosophy with Thales, about whom we know virtually nothing. And if you look at a slightly more careful historian of philosophy, Aristotle begins with the Egyptians at the beginning of the Metaphysics in his inquiry into where philosophy came from, who were the first people who engaged in inquiries that sort of belong, that are philosophical in character. And he thinks it was the Egyptians because they had this leisure class of priests who could engage in these inquiries. And he's right about that. Egyptian and Babylonian scientific and philosophical inquiries clearly played some role, though we don't know what, in the development of early Greek philosophy as well. So all over our curricula are writ these 19th century German principles, and that's not surprising because our institutions, University of Chicago and Columbia, are two of these institutions that were refounded on the German model at the end of the 19th century when Americans decided to have universities and not just colleges. So the program, intellectual program of the American Research University is this German program fit on top of existing liberal arts colleges, and it's a very awkward fit for all kinds of reasons. The divisions between research and teaching, we hire people to do research, they're very bad at teaching. They don't want to teach in the core curriculum, aside from a few weirdos like me. So we have all these pathologies, but some of these pathologies are not merely social, they're intellectual, and the students pick up on them. So there is a real critique here about the ways that the classical tradition is deployed as a weapon. But the students are not really equipped to make that version of the critique. It's a very subtle one. It's not a coarse one. And it doesn't take away from other modes of engaging with the classical tradition, such as we heard about earlier. So the fact that there is this one mode that might be recruited for a certain political project might be neither here nor there for what we're doing in the classroom. That's at least a possibility. Another critique that I'm interested in that they often bring up is centered on a notion that I don't have a very good grip on, but people talk a lot about, which is representation. So the idea is that this canon of texts is exclusive to the students studying them because the authors of those texts do not reflect, insert some set of identity categories that the students identify with, whether that's ethnic or racial or gender categories. And sometimes, here's a further version of this critique, there's a thought that the students learn best when their identities are represented. This is a familiar idea in a certain way. I think it's an extension of another idea, which is that people learn best from teachers who look like them. And the evidence for that is pretty weak. I think students learn best from teachers who know how to reach the kinds of students they're teaching. But I also think that this idea misses a good deal of the point of humanistic education. I encourage them to think about diversity differently, to think about the point of learning from others who are different as part of the purpose of coming together in these fora. And that the gaps in time and space and cultural forms between us and absolutely everyone on the syllabus renders, especially the ancient authors, basically like aliens from another world to us in all kinds of ways. And thinking that a student who, I don't know, has predominantly European heritage can get something out of Homer or whoever is behind the Iliad is, I think, an insane idea. And when it comes to 20th century works, I prescind from that question. I think we shouldn't be, I'm a little troubled that we go as far as Virginia Woolf, who's a little bit recent for my taste. Just because I think we should be cautious about predicting what texts will be canonical in the future. And I think we do owe something to the future when we craft these syllabuses. So all that's to say that I think there are weak versions of this critique, but I do think that they do get something right, these critiques based on representation, which is that the syllabus, because it's required, and it's required of every Columbia College student, we are the last research university that requires all of the undergraduates of one of its colleges to do this. Because even at the University of Chicago, they can take media aesthetics. Like, I taught in Human Being and Citizen, the traditional core that Leon and Amy Cass molded. But they can opt out of that if they want. At Columbia, they cannot. And so the syllabus has an expressive function in the same way that the architecture of our campus has an expressive function. And so when they walk down College Walk through the center of the Columbia campus, and they see on the facade of Butler Library, the main library of the university, this enormous neoclassical building, the names of Homer, Plato, Demosthenes, Cicero, Sophocles, they get the message. These are the important guys. And that fails to actually capture the intellectual work of the modern research university. Like, I happen to be at the intersection of the guys on Butler Library and what I work on, but my department recently hired our first specialist in non-Western philosophy, a department of more than 20. And if you think about it, I mean, maybe you don't know this, but classical Indian and classical Chinese philosophy are just as old, just as historically complex, just as varied as a set of traditions. They're not single traditions, as the set of traditions that early Greek philosophy and Greek philosophy more broadly inspired and influenced, which of course includes medieval Arabic philosophy, which we also don't have covered in our department. So as an intellectual community in the philosophy department, we are trying to correct a serious gap in our intellectual offerings that goes hand in hand with the existence of that gap and the kind of pervasiveness of it in philosophy departments is connected to a history of regarding classical Indian and classical Chinese philosophy and later members of those traditions down to the modern period as just so much Oriental mysticism. And if you've ever tried to read the arguments of the Nyaya Sutra, they are written in as precise and logical a vocabulary as contemporary analytic philosophy. So at any rate, I think the students pick up on these gaps. And again, with this grafting of the research university, with its very diverse, varied interests sitting on top of this traditional model of humanistic education, there's a problem of fit between those two. So let me conclude by just making some practical recommendations about how we avoid making the classical tradition an idol and inviting these criticisms which can lead students not to experience its riches and the transformative possibilities of sitting down and reading these texts carefully. So I think one important recommendation I would make is to avoid defensiveness. And that turns on identifying for ourselves the serious versions of the critiques of Eurocentric great book syllabuses, for instance. What is the most serious version of that critique? And if you haven't done that for yourself, it's very hard to engage with the non-serious versions. I also think we need to practice openness to other traditions in material ways. So we can't just say what Columbia says now, which is, well, we have something called the Global Core, and you can go to the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, African Studies and take a course on Indian intellectual history or African intellectual history or whatever else. We can't say we have space for that elsewhere in our syllabus. We can't because we require these courses, literature, humanities, and contemporary civilization. And from their names, they connote a sense of this is about literature generally or about the humanities generally. And that can't just be Greek and Roman stuff with a bit of the Bible thrown in. So I can't change the common syllabus too much because I do owe my students a version of the course they signed up for. But I do teach a Sanskrit epic in the fall, Bharavi's Arjuna and the Hunter. I find the students like having a break from the Greek and Roman literature on the common syllabus. But even more importantly, it helps them engage more deeply with Virgil and Homer on a comparative basis. They start to think about epic literature more broadly rather than being stifled by getting just one tradition. It's not hard to do, and I'm pushing for broader inclusion in other ways as well. And finally, I think we need to be full-throated in our defense of universalism. I'm very troubled by the idea that we are losing a grip on the common nature of humanity and, even more, the common patrimony that we all share. The cultural heritage of all cultures belongs to us jointly. And asserting that is getting harder and harder. And identity categories that are commonly used in talking about diversity on our campuses are just extraordinarily superficial in relation to the vast and almost indefinite variety of human experience. And I try to practice this a little bit with humor in the classroom. I try to do it with humor. Here I am, an Indian American who grew up partly in the Caribbean and partly in Texas. I'm an Aristotle scholar. I think Aristotle is amazing. I will talk to you about Aristotle for weeks, months, years. I love this stuff. I live this stuff. I go home and think about it, you know. But saying that doesn't mean that the identity categories themselves are empty. They have social realities that do impinge on my students' lives in serious ways. So in defending this universalism, I don't mean to sweep all of that talk out. I just don't think it counteracts the universalism, the common humanity, the common patrimony elements. And if I can claim Homer, they can too. Who's Homer to me? Right? Who's Homer to anyone alive today? Who's Homer even to the Greeks, right? With their 200-year-old country. We're not supposed to talk about that, but it's a very awkward subject. Over the summer, I was at a symposium honoring the 2400th anniversary of Aristotle's birth in Aristotle's birthplace in northern Greece. And the Greek justice minister was there and gave a talk. So, you know, that's not the room to have that conversation in. But I think I can do it here. So what I want my students to get is a sense that engaging in this humanistic inquiry, where they don't immediately shut themselves off from the enormous riches of the different traditions, that being equipped with that intellectual formation is the best way for them to confront the issues of contemporary concern in sophisticated ways, in ways that merit serious consideration. And I think we can do that without including authors on the syllabus because we think it'll make the students not notice how Eurocentric the other 95% of our syllabus is. I think this is an ongoing and a challenging project, but I think it's a very vital one. And I'm encouraged by signs that humane education, classical tradition, great books, so on, they may not be flourishing in our universities, as we heard a little bit about from Dena yesterday, but I think people remain passionately interested about them. And in this dark period that we're in, these dark ages, we can hold on to that thought in hope of a renewal of this model in a new and better form. And that's what I would like to devote myself to for the next few decades. Thank you.